Well, if the Shroud of Turin is the legitimate burial shroud of Jesus Christ, how did it get from Jerusalem to Turin? My guest today has a lot of interesting theories and some very compelling arguments to support them. Don't go away, I'll be right back. Hey there, Gracious Gang, it's Mike Creavey. Mike Creavey, the host of the Gracious Guest Show from thegraciousguest.org, here with you today. Please make sure you subscribe to this channel, like this video, share it far and wide with someone that you think will get something out of this today. There's a lot of really intriguing historical theories about the origin of what we now call the Shroud of Turin, where it traveled through many different centuries, if it is indeed the authentic burial shroud of Jesus. With me today to unpack all of this is Jack Markwardt. Jack is the author of The Hidden History of the Shroud of Turin. I've got my paperback copy here. I also have it on Kindle, which is great, to be able to search through it. This is a very meticulously researched and very, very detailed exploration through some different theories about where the shroud traveled over the centuries. Jack really did his homework here. This is a really fascinating read, and it was a really, really just great blessing and delight to be able to talk to him at length about this. This was published in 2021. I've got all the links down there for you. Let me just share quickly about Jack. Jack Markwardt was born in Philadelphia and raised in South Jersey. At Rutgers University, he earned top scholastic honors while majoring in history and foreign languages. And at Albany Law School, where he served as an editor of the Law Review, he received his Juris Doctor degree cum laude. He has practiced law and litigated cases in several states and federal jurisdictions. A Shroud scholar for 38 years, he has authored numerous papers which he has presented at international conferences. His recent book, The Hidden History of the Shroud of Turin, recounts the Shroud's ancient and medieval history, and his recent article, The Provenance of the Latin Sermon, presents textual evidence of the Shroud's presence in 10th century Constantinople, almost 300 years before radiocarbon dating allows for its existence. So without further ado, let's jump into this fascinating chat I was able to have here today with Jack Markwardt, author of The Hidden History of the Shroud of Turin. Check it out. All right, we're good to go. Jack Markwardt, thank you so much for joining us here on the Gracious Guest Show today.
It's great to be here, Mike.
It's funny. I haven't actually had a Shroud interview in a while. There was a while there where it was like every couple weeks. It was just, so I haven't lost any steam, but, it's been busy. We have a new baby that just arrived. We're excited about. You might hear him in the background occasionally.
Okay.
But I picked up at some point a couple months back, I'd heard your name come up. I'd seen you appear a couple times in some Shroud related videos I had come across. And as a originally a history major myself, someone who's a real student of history and just has always been fascinated by history, this question is not just important, I think, to me when it comes to the Shroud, but it's really essential, because
Yeah.
we can say a lot of stuff about the Shroud. We can look at all the amazing properties of it. God is capable of producing miracles anytime He wants. But the central claim that this thing is the actual burial shroud of Jesus, if it is, it needs to go all the way back to the tomb.
It's
So
true.
there's a lot of different theories. And it's interesting to me. There's different theories. I've had folks on this program before, kind of share, different possible theories. Yours is a little bit different. So I thought this would be really neat to look at. And I found your book really well sourced and very deep. And so we can't get to all of it, but I just want to turn it over to you, and I'll be quiet and just ask where would you want to start here with how we should look at this question of the provenance of the historical background here of the Shroud.
Well, I would start with maybe a broader overview about history. I agree with you. I think to some of us, the history is more important than science. It's easier to understand, uh, and you know, uh, you're not going to get to a finding of authenticity unless you can present a credible history of the shroud. Um, and I've always thought that with my background, which was a practice of law, that if you're going to make a case for something, it has to be based on evidence, and the evidence has to be credible. and all the people who are reading about the shroud, they're like members of a jury who are hearing a case, and they have to decide what evidence is credible and what evidence is not credible to come to an ultimate conclusion. So when
Sure.
I've done my writing on the shroud, it's always been based on historical sources, and I've always tried to take the history in context. And history has changed over the years. But what the ancients thought is not what we think today. What the church's policies were at various times have changed over the
Hmm.
years. And so we have to look at the evidence in that context. And when you do that, some of what has been suggested about the Shroud's history to me is um, rather absurd because it doesn't fit with the evidence and it's contradicted by the evidence. And some of the people who study it and write about it contradict themselves inherently. So, in my 38 years of studying the Shroud and writing about it, I tried to be consistent, but at the same time, as new information has become available, I've never hesitated to modify uh, what my conclusions are, just as a juror would do as the case developed and more evidence came in. So that's the way that I
Hmm.
would approach it from an overview. For today, I thought it might be interesting to take a look at Shroud history, maybe from the standpoint of the transfers of the Shroud, where it was, uh, and where it got to, and why it got to where it did, and
Hmm.
why ultimately do we have this rather extensive period of silence in the Shroud's history. I think anyone who is going to deal with it should explain that and come up with a credible explanation. So I think if we start right in the tomb
Hmm.
and simply for the sake of time assume that the burial cloth of Jesus, which is mentioned in the scripture by the synoptics specifically, that shroud was the Shroud of Turin. Uh, the it's very important to know that the scripture was written several decades, most scholars believe, after the events. And a lot of people did not know this. I think only myself and eventually Larry Stolley has talked about this, that the church imposed a practice called the discipline of the secret, in which the pearls of the faith were to be referred to metaphorically and cryptically because they did not want the pagans and the persecutors, to
Hmm.
know about the various pearls. So when you take a look at the Gospels and the burial scripture, you find out that yes, there was definitely a shroud. Jesus' body was wrapped in it. But when the Sunday morning comes around, the shroud is not mentioned, which is very odd because
Hmm.
to have put all that time into describing the wrapping of Jesus in in the shroud, you would think that the evangelist would say either we found the shroud in the tomb, or they would say we found the shroud to be missing from the tomb. But neither is said, and so there must be a reason why the gospel writers wrote it that way. And I think it was so that there was not a curiosity aroused about whether or not Jesus' shroud was found, and whether at the time the Gospels were written, where it could have been, who was
Hmm.
preserving it for, and for what reasons. Now, if the shroud that was found in the tomb was the Shroud of Turin, in all likelihood, it had an image on it at that time. The image could have gradually developed, but in all likelihood, an image or part of an image could be seen at that time. And the blood that we see on the Shroud of Turin today would also have been observable. Now, this created a
Sure.
problem for Jesus' disciples. They were Jews, observant Jews, and it was a violation of the second commandment to create images. And it was certainly a violation of the second commandment to worship images. In
Hmm.
addition, the Jews had a lot of different purity laws, one of which was that a cloth that touched a corpse was impure, and also a
Hmm.
cloth which had blood on it was impure, and so therefore the cloth really should not be preserved and certainly should not be transmitted because the impurity could have been transmitted. So,
And by the way, Jack, that has been brought up before in some YouTube comments, as sort of an immediate, by at least one person, as sort of an immediate dismissal of even the idea of them taking the shroud, which I think is, I mean, it's recognizing an important point, but maybe going too far. So I don't mean to interrupt, but I just thought
no,
I'd mention that because this does come up.
well, remember that all of this history, as I said from the beginning, needs to be taken in context. And that's kind of a nice principle that, people might discuss. But who has the shroud at that time? If it's the Jesus disciples, what are their beliefs? They knew that they didn't create the image.
Hmm.
They knew that Jesus was capable of miraculous acts and God was capable of miraculous acts. And so they knew that there was no violation of the second commandment because no man had made that image. That image had been made of God, and that's why by God, and that's why later it's referred to as akira puatus, or not made by human hands. So in the eyes of the disciples, they were not violating the second commandment. But
Right.
nevertheless, what could they do with the shroud at that time when they're in Judea? And in Judea, the Judean Jews have this scrupulous enforcement of the second commandment, so much so that a few years before, when Pontius Pilate tried to bring what they called ensigns or images of Tiberius into Jerusalem, and
Right.
Tiberius was being held out by the Romans as divine, the Jews went into a protest for a week, and they essentially forced Pilate to remove the ensigns from Jerusalem. So
Sure.
they could not present the shroud to their fellow Jews, and they knew that were they to be discovered with the shroud and such an image, not only would the observant Jews destroy it, but they would then persecute the disciples for having it in their possession, and probably
Hmm.
accuse the disciples of having created the image. So something had to be done with the shroud. It had to go somewhere. There's very little evidence for the shroud remaining in Jerusalem. Eventually, like perhaps maybe a year after Jesus' crucifixion, the Jewish authorities began what was called the Great Persecution. It was headed up by Saul, who was later to become Paul.
Mm-hmm.
And as part of this persecution, they were breaking into Christians' homes and meeting places. And it made it even likelier that they would discover the shroud. So the obvious solution to this would be to move the shroud out of Jerusalem to an area where it would be safe, to an area where the Gentiles ruled, because the Gentiles had nothing against images and they didn't have any of these purity laws.
Right.
So we have to look at, where did the shroud go when it was taken from Jerusalem? Now, for years in shroud studies, which I'm sure you know, it's been suggested that the shroud went to the city of Edessa in
Hmm.
Mesopotamia. And this is based on a legend, a Christian legend, which is called the Abgar legend.
Right.
And the Abgar legend, it comes in various versions. It changes over the centuries, but obviously the most reliable version would be the earliest version. And this is the version that was published by Eusebius in 325 and later became the basis of the doctrine of Adai. The version of which we have is from around the year 400. And in
Hmm.
that version of the legend, it is a servant of Abgar who comes to Jerusalem. He paints Jesus' uh, likeness. That's the word that's used, um,
Okay.
with choice pigments. And he brings it directly back to Edessa, meaning that the cloth that was brought at that time, according to legend, is not Jesus' shroud. Jesus is still alive.
Right.
The image is of a living Jesus.
Is it a facial image?
No,
Is that the
that's
impression, or
another
we don't?
thing that has confused
Yeah.
people. If you go back
Right.
to the original Greek and the scholar who discovered the text, the Greek word is likeness. Now, when Ian
Okay.
Wilson first got involved with suggesting a history back in 1978, it
Hmm.
was his purpose to uh, convince people that the shroud was actually at this point after Jesus' death, it was folded in a way and framed in a way that only the face could be seen.
Right.
And so, in various chapters of his book, he uses the word portrait. But
Okay.
if you go back to the text, you're not going to find the word portrait. You're going to find
That's
the
not the
word
word there. Okay.
likeness. Which, in a way,
Likeness.
if you're really pro authenticity in the shroud, you're better off having the word that's there, likeness, because that's how you would describe the image of the shroud. Using the word portrait
Hmm.
is really only advances the hypothesis that the shroud was folded and thereafter became an icon known as the image of Edessa and the Mandylion.
Mm.
But in any event, according to the legend, the image simply goes back to Edessa and Abgar puts it in his palace. Later, uh, a disciple by the name of Thaddeus or Adai goes to Edessa, cures Abgar of an illness that he has, and converts him to Christianity. This is the original Abgar legend. And in Eusebius, an image is not even mentioned. What I've previously talked
Mm.
about was in the doctrine of Adai. And so it's a pretty much from a historical standpoint, it's pretty much of a long shot that is historically what happened to the shroud uh, after Jesus' death. Uh, there are historians who and scholars who absolutely reject the Abgar legend uh, in the manner that it is told. Uh, that is that a image of Jesus went to King Abgar the Fifth. There
Hmm.
is not a iota of historical evidence that Christianity came to Edessa in the first century,
Hmm.
that Abgar knew Jesus or wrote to Jesus, or that he knew any of Jesus' disciples. And in fact, the first evangelization of Edessa takes place in about the year 100, in which there's actually a historical figure named Adai who went to
Hmm.
Mesopotamia and he evangelized around another city, Nisibis, but not
Okay.
in Edessa. And so uh, I think it was J.B. Siegel, he's the most prominent historian of Edessa. He has called the Abgar legend one of the most successful frauds that has ever been perpetrated um,
Huh.
in terms of religious history. So, what is the Abgar legend if it's not a historical account of the first century uh, conversion of Edessa? Well, there are a number of scholars who have said that it's an allegorical description of the actual conversion of a later king of Edessa, King Abgar the Eighth, or Abgar the Great,
Oh.
who history shows did convert to Christianity, and that the city of Edessa was converted in approximately the year 190 to the year 200. How do we know this?
Okay.
Why do they think this? There are living personages from that era, kings and popes and bishops, and even the son of Abgar the Great, uh, who are referenced in the Abgar legend, and who obviously were not alive in the first century.
Hmm.
And therefore, the text had to be written, or at least it had to be amended in the age of Abgar the Great. And there's various theories as to why the legend was written as an allegory at that time. My own view is that it was written at a time, originally written at a time, um, right after Abgar had converted and the situation with the Roman emperor had changed. Uh, During the conversion of Abgar the Great, Rome was ruled by Commodus, who was the son of Marcus Aurelius, who is
Hmm.
fictionalized in Gladiator. If you've seen that movie.
Sure, yeah. Joaquin Phoenix, yep.
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 And he married a Christian, and the church had what was called 13 years of profound peace between the years
Hmm.
180 and 193.
Hmm.
And during this period, Abgar the Great changed his coinage and actually put Christian symbols on his coinage, including a cross. And I think it was pretty much believed at that time by Abgar and by a lot of other people in the Roman Empire that the persecution of Christianity had come to an end. But Commodus was
Sure.
assassinated. He wasn't killed in the arena, he was assassinated. And
Right.
upon his assassination, a new line of Roman emperors who were pagan and who wanted to persecute Christians came into rule. And once that happened, Abgar could not have it acknowledged that he had allowed the city of Edessa in some part to be converted, that he had personally been converted. And that's why the story is written in such a way as to set forth a historical fact of the conversion of Abgar and Edessa, but framed and pushed back to the
Interesting.
first century. So
Okay.
if in fact the shroud did not go to Edessa, if you're not going to try to treat the legend as history, where else could it have gone? And back in 1998, I wrote a paper in which I tried to trace the shroud's history at that point through the likely custodian of the shroud and through the likely place where it was taken. And that turned out to be
Hmm.
Peter, St. Peter, the Apostle Peter.
Hmm.
And the place to which he took it was Antioch. Now, Peter, um, the church does not say uh, anything specifically about uh, the shroud. There is a apocryphal gospel called the Gospel of the Hebrews, in which there is a fragment of it which claims that Jesus, upon being resurrected, took his shroud from the tomb and gave it to someone called the servant of the priest. It's rather cryptical. But it does
Hmm.
seem to indicate that at the time that that was written, which was late first century, early second century, that it was known that the shroud was being preserved. Well, there is a tradition in the church called the Petrine tradition of the Jesus burial shroud. And Petrine refers to the fact that there's a series of texts which connect Peter the apostle with Jesus' shroud. So you can find this in the writings of Saint Nino from the 4th century. There is a rather famous amendment to the Mozarabic liturgy in the early part of the 7th century,
That
late
that
6th century.
fascinates me.
Hmm.
That's really, yeah.
Because all of a sudden, and seemingly out of nowhere, there is a provision in this liturgy that Peter and John not just ran to the tomb, but when they ran to the tomb, they found um, uh, an image of Jesus on the shroud, on Jesus' burial cloth. And there's a later text, but I think it reflects an early Eastern Church tradition that actually says Peter and John went to the tomb. They removed all the burial cloths from the tomb, and the shroud was retained by Peter, who then would use it the shroud by arranging it in some way on his head and thereby invoking its helps at various times. And
Hmm.
I think this reflects the tradition that Peter, at some points, probably in attempting to evangelize, simply took the shroud and draped it over his head, and therefore the ventral or front image could be seen uh, at the front of Peter, and the dorsal image could be seen on the back of Peter. Um,
Hmm.
these are the writings of Ishudad of Merv, who was a Eastern bishop, and they're not widely known. They've only been uh, gathering attention, say, in the last 10 years or so.
Hmm.
Um, and
Well,
so,
and while that kind of behavior would no doubt, like you said with context earlier, be something completely unthinkable within a Mosaic law kind of Jewish context,
right,
it's perhaps not more unthinkable, potentially than the elimination of the dietary laws or the circumcision rule, like all those things we see for sure in the early church's sort of growth and understanding of what exactly this new movement is, because
yeah,
they
and
didn't just wake up one day and say, "Oh, we are the fulfillment of Judaism." It was there were things that they had to sort of have revealed to them, but this could have been, along those same lines, perhaps.
well, and if in fact the shroud was put into the custody of Peter, there are things about Peter that are truly unique among all of the apostles. Uh, it's reported in Acts that he began to spend time with and visit with Gentiles. This was
Hmm.
contrary to Jewish tradition and law. I think it was in his speech on Pentecost that he made reference to the fact that salvation comes to all the nations uh,
Hmm.
through Jesus Christ. And therefore, he is repudiating the quintessential Jewish doctrine of a exclusive covenant between God and the Jewish people. So if you look at what the things were that Peter said and did, he would not have had any qualms about taking what he knew was a valid relic of Jesus and uh, using it, employing it in evangelization. He would not have been concerned that back in Judea and among Jews, they would have found it offensive. Um,
Hmm.
uh, and the effect on Gentiles would have been just the opposite. If he were to use the shroud for evangelization, it would draw a crowd, a large crowd of Gentiles. And a certain number of those Gentiles would take the shroud and the shroud image as some kind of tangential proof that Jesus lived, he died, he crucified, and some may have seen the shroud, as some do today, as proof of his resurrection. So it would have been a very powerful
Mm.
tool, and it's known. It's not in the Acts, but it's in a number of Christian texts that Peter went to while the great persecution was ongoing. He went to the city of Antioch. He
Hmm.
became its first bishop, um, and that during this period, Antioch converted.
Right. That's
And
where they first became called Christians because of the
yes,
Greek
it's when they
language
first became
prominence.
known as Christians. Paul and Barnabas were also working there. Um, at that time. And there's never really been a good explanation for how Antioch became um, Christianized. Luke says that some disciples from Cyprus preached there, and that's what did the trick. But, almost every gospel and the Acts of the Apostles put forward what I call the miracle conversion paradigm, and that is when you look at who is converting, individuals and peoples, it's almost always in the light of a miracle of some kind. Even
Yeah.
during Jesus' ministry, if you look at the conversions, many of them, not all of them, but many of them are occasioned by miracles which he's worked. And
Hmm.
even Paul works some miracles and uses them in conversion. And so it just makes perfect logical contextual sense that if Peter was in Antioch and he was the first bishop and he established the church there, and if he had the shroud with him, that he would have used the shroud to as a conversion device to convert some Gentiles at that time. Now, there's two other things quickly that um, I think are corroborating proofs of the shroud being with Peter in Antioch. One I can't go into very deeply because it's a very complex discussion, but there is the scripture from Galatians 3:1, in which Paul recites to the Galatians who have at this point relapsed that he's
Mm,
very surprised. They're very foolish because uh, uh, Jesus Christ had been clearly portrayed to them as crucified. Now, there's a big
right.
argument over what that means. For years,
Sure.
through John Calvin, it's always been suggested that Paul was such a great speaker that he verbally described the crucifixion of Jesus, and that's what he was referring to. But you see more and more exegetes who say no,
Mhm.
the word that's used there, the Greek word prographo that's used there, it definitely denotes something in the form of a picture, something artistic
Right.
that transpired at that time.
That's artwork
And I've
graphic, like there's, any,
yes,
it's a
that's
pretty
the root.
straightforward, yeah.
So and Peter wrote his first epistle to the to various groups that he had evangelized among. That included the Galatians, and there are church texts that say that Peter evangelized among the Galatians. And Paul does not say that I presented this portrayal of Jesus Christ. He says it in the passive voice. He says it was um, portrayed to you. And
Mm,
therefore, I believe that that in accordance with the tradition that that Peter used the shroud, arranged it on his head, and sought helps from it. I think in the unique and particular case of the Galatians, who must have been a very difficult people to convert because they relapsed so quickly, that Peter did
right.
in fact use the shroud in order to help obtain their conversion. Now, I also quickly want to mention that the conversion of the Galatians occurred somewhere in the early 50s, and
Hmm.
the great persecution by the Jews ended in the year 44 with the death of Herod Agrippa I. So there was this period of peace in the church between 44 and 64, which is when Nero started the
The Nero.
Roman
Sure.
persecutions, where I don't think that the discipline of the secret had to be adhered to quite so closely. And again, most Christians probably believe that their persecutors were the Jews. And once the Jews stopped doing that, because when Herod died, Rome went back to having procurators, and they ruled Judea at that time. I think that Christians felt that they were fairly safe in uh, taking some chances that would advance conversions at that time, just as what would happen 150 years later when the shroud was used to convert Abgar the Great during a period of peace and non-persecution.
Sure.
So that's kind of what I wanted to cover in this segment.
Hmm.
Um, and that is that the shroud moved from Jerusalem to Antioch through
Sure.
St. Peter. And when Peter then went to Rome, he simply left the shroud with the church of Antioch. By that time, by 70, there are um, full fledged Roman persecutions of the church going on. And so the shroud is not being referred to, it's not being brought out in public, and it essentially remains in Antioch for the next several hundred years. It's only taken to Edessa at the end of the second century to convert King Abgar the Great.
Mm.
And there are church texts which describe how in 362 uh, the pagan Roman Emperor Julian the Apostate persecuted
Mm-hmm.
the Church of Antioch. And at that time, he attempted to seize the church treasures which were in the Cathedral of Antioch,
Yes.
and how the presbyter hid the uh, treasures of the cathedral, among which I think was the Turin Shroud. And he
Okay.
would not tell Julian and the pagans where he had hidden them, and his head was ceremoniously removed from him at that
Hmm.
time. And I do think there the shroud then kind of went uh, into hiding. Its location was lost for a period of about 175 years, which rather explains the ultimate Byzantine Abgar legend, which indicates that the image of Jesus was placed in a wall and was lost for
Hmm.
a period of time.
Would you think you're saying a wall likely in Antioch as opposed to a wall in Edessa?
Yes, that what
Okay.
happened was the actual fact that was known is that the shroud was in a wall, a city wall, above a city
Mm-hmm.
gate. And in this case, it would have been the Cherubim Gate, the southern gate of
Right.
Antioch. But when the Byzantines are writing this portion of the legend, they've just received from Edessa the image of Edessa, and they're trying to create a history for the cloth that they have.
Sure.
So they take the tradition of the cloth having been in a wall, hidden in a wall during a period of persecution, and in order to explain why no one hears about it in Edessa for the first 500 years, they claim, without any historical basis, that Abgar's grandson uh, returned the city to paganism, persecuted the church, and the Christians hid the shroud. Uh, uh, they would have called it the Mandilion, but hid that
Mm-hmm.
object in the city wall of Edessa for a period of 500 years. So
Right.
I pick up, so that explains the original transfer. And the next transfer is how did the cloth come to leave Antioch? Uh, about in about the year 538, there's a text that says, suddenly there appears in Antioch at the time that its city walls are being repaired from a series of earthquakes, which took place in 526 and 528. Suddenly there appears what they call an awesome image of Jesus. It appears
Hmm.
in the district, which is located exactly adjacent to this city wall, to this gate. And
Hmm.
that, I think, is the documents the rediscovery of the shroud. The shroud was this awesome image. And I think it could have had a very fine history in Antioch. Uh, and it would have then been connected with the apostolic times had something not transpired. And that was the fact that the Persian king at that time, Khosrus, decided that he was going to conquer Antioch, and he brought his army to the city walls, and he demanded a ransom which the Antiochenes would not pay. And just before the attack, uh, Procopius, a Byzantine historian, describes how Ephraimius fled from Antioch and went west to Anatolia. Now, this is totally
Mm-hmm.
out of the character of any what they call warrior bishop at that time, that he would leave the city. It didn't
Right.
speak well of him. It looked like it could be cowardice. But what I
Right.
believe
Exactly.
happened is that he wanted to save the shroud from the attack of the Persians, and he left and he took the shroud with him to Anatolia. And it was very lucky that he did, because the Persians came into Antioch and completely destroyed the city. They set it
Right.
afire. They took its resident slaves back to Persia. And at that time, the Roman emperor was Justinian the First. And we then had the series of, I'll call them unprecedented developments, which occur in Constantinople. I believe Ephraimius took the shroud and put it in the temporary custody of Justinian. because he had to go back and help his flock in Antioch. And Justinian then had the shroud, and I think he was just supposed to be a temporary caretaker of the shroud. And the idea was that Antioch would get rebuilt, and Ephraimius would come back and claim the shroud and bring it back to Antioch. Unfortunately for
Mm-hmm.
Ephraimius, he went back to Antioch. They had a plague, and in 545 he died.
Mm.
And so at this point, uh, Ephraimius, who was one of the few people I think who knew that he had taken the shroud to Constantinople, he is dead, and Justinian has the shroud, and he wants to make it a Byzantine relic that he can keep in his
Mm-hmm.
collection. But there's always the threat that if he tells what transpired, that the Church of Antioch, when that is reestablished, is going to demand it back.
Okay.
So we have the following evidences that I'll go over rather quickly. That the shroud is in Constantinople with Justinian. There is this famous
No.
image
Yes.
of the Christ Pantocrator, which Justinian had created.
I have it on my door up here. I can't
Okay,
get it, but yeah.
he created it. All the
Yeah.
scholars say that he created it. Not he was
That's
the
the St.
artist, but he
Catherine
had it created.
Monastery. Is that correct?
What's that?
Is it the St. Catherine Monastery?
Yes, in the Sinai.
That's okay.
And
Mm-hmm. Yep.
he built that. He had that monastery built. It was built between
Yeah.
547 and 565, and this
Okay.
image is still there. So where did
Right.
he get the model for this type of image? And this is the first
Right.
Pantocrator or Pantocrator image of Jesus, in which he has
Yes.
famously the hair parted in the center. One part comes
Right.
to a shoulder, one part falls behind the shoulder,
Mm-hmm.
and it's incredibly similar to the image of the torn shroud. That's created
Right.
by Justinian during this period of time. Justinian also, after the Byzantine army conquers the city of Ravenna in Italy, the Byzantines now install mosaics in the churches of Ravenna, and there is this famous mosaic uh, of Jesus,
Yes.
and you can see that that too takes on the Pantocrator um, styling.
And this is like we've had this come up. We don't have to go into all the details on the art history side of it, but this has come up before on the show that this is a thing, a detail a lot of people I think miss, that it's not just some superficial like, oh, okay, yeah, it looks similar. There are, there have been extensive studies done showing the remarkable detail and similarities in the proportions of the
Yeah,
features and how that was just absolutely not the norm, and then all
right,
of a sudden it becomes the norm all over the
right.
place.
And but I think what's not emphasized, Mike, is that a lot of the people who are involved in the shroud say that, and the implication I think they try to draw is because they have totally theoretically uh, decided that the shroud, which was in the wall of Edessa, must have been discovered
Right.
at that time, where there's
Yeah.
no historical proof of this. There's historical
Sure.
proof of a flood that occurred in 525. But even the Abgar legend does not say that the shroud or that the image was discovered in the wall. It simply says when the Persians attacked, the
Mm-hmm.
Edessans went and retrieved this image and supposedly used it in terms of the attack. But these images
Okay.
are not coming from Edessa. These are
Right.
Byzantine images. This is in the monastery created by the Byzantines. It's in the
Mm-hmm.
Church of Ravenna by the Byzantines. And I think a lot of times, and I know I thought this when I read Wilson originally, you get in the impression that these images were created a little further down the line in the 6th century when there
Mm-hmm.
definitely was something called the image of Edessa. But these images are certified as having been created in the period of the 540s or the 550s. And there's just no
Mm-hmm.
way that the image of Edessa, assuming that it even existed at that time, that and that this kind of detail in its imaging would have become known in Constantinople. fact, one of the greatest
Hmm.
historians
That's a
of
good point.
Byzantium, modern, um, Professor Cameron, she has said that the what the image of Edessa looked like did not even become known in Byzantium until the ninth or the 10th century. The fact that there
Okay.
even was an image of Edessa was not known in Byzantium until around 726. So these
Okay.
images are not attributable to the image of Edessa, assuming that it even existed. This is attributable to something that they had in Constantinople in the 540s, as early as the 540s. Also, suddenly the higher classes in Constantinople start wearing a piece of clothing known as the tablion. Tablion. It's a square piece of clothing. Here's a picture of it. It shows, again, in a church from Ravenna. The central figure here is Justinian. He's in the center. And if you look at this
Okay.
object that's right under his right arm, it looks like a rectangular piece of cloth. That's a
Yes.
tablion. And the two people to his right are also have that. Now,
Yes. Okay.
this article of clothing eventually evolved into a piece of clothing in Constantinople called the loris. And this clothing was clothing that from that time, from the 6th century right on through uh, into the 11th, 12th century, it was representative of Jesus' shroud. The loris was representative of Jesus' shroud, and so was its predecessor, the tablion. So why do the Byzantines suddenly, in during the reign of Justinian, invent this article of clothing and begin to wear it? Again, I think the obvious answer is because the shroud is in Constantinople, and now they are making a special veneration of it.
Hmm.
Um, and finally, there is a procession in Anatolia. It takes place at the direction of Emperor Justinian between the years 554 and 560 of an image of Jesus on a linen cloth. And this
Hmm.
is the first image of Jesus that's ever referred to as a Kirapuatis, not made by human hands.
Okay.
Uh, the uh, the procession is memorialized in a chronicle that was written in 568. So that is some 25 years before Evagrius writes about there being an Aquarius image, supposedly, in Edessa during the Persian siege of 544. So the first
Hmm.
time that an image of Jesus is described as a Quiriquatus is, again, under Justinian, uh, in connection with the procession which he authorizes and directs. And this is a image on linen, although I suspect that probably the shroud was folded for in that purpose, and what was being displayed was only the face of Jesus, because Justinian did
Hmm.
not want anyone then alive to know that he had this full length image of Jesus, which had come from Antioch, which the people
Hmm.
in Antioch knew existed from its discovery there.
And
So
it's hard
you
to
look at
imagine
these,
anyone seeing a facial image like that, in all the pomp and circumstances, going to assume, "Hey, I wonder if it's a full body image that's folded." Like I feel it's. I don't think it's a far stretch to just sort of make that assumption, right? That your typical person seeing that image is going to assume that there's a reason they're seeing it that way, and maybe that's all there is to it.
yeah.
You know.
And then at the same time, the historian who, at Justinian's direction, wrote about the procession, he gave this image a history.
Hmm.
It's what they would call a legendary history, but he said that it had originally come from the village of Camiliana in
Okay.
Anatolia. it had been found in a well by a woman there, and that she then had brought the image into a church, and that it proceeded to work miracles at that time. So
Hmm.
again, Justinian laid the groundwork for the fact that this image that was now in Anatolia, which was brought back to Constantinople, had nothing to do with Antioch, and had everything to do with it having been discovered at some earlier date in the small village of Camiliana. Uh,
Hmm.
right after that, in 574, the Byzantine emperors recognized that they now had in their relic collection um, a image of Jesus. The Byzantines referred to this image from that point forward as the image of God incarnate. There's a rich history of it between 574 and iconoclasm, when that comes into effect. And some of the things that happened during that time was that the Byzantine church, which had been highly iconoclastic, suddenly now became in favor of icons. They allowed a
Hmm.
relic cult to develop in Constantinople. They allowed crucifixes. This is the time that crucifixes began, and this is a crucifix portrayal from 586 from a Syrian book,
Mm-hmm.
in which you can see Jesus is clothed in accordance with the modesty standards at that time. Um,
Sure.
but before this time, other than the graffiti, the famous Roman graffiti, Jesus was not being portrayed as crucified. So why again all of a sudden is this happening? Um, in Constantinople at that time, there are church representatives, one of whom goes back to Spain and is instrumental in the modification of the uh, Mozarabic liturgy, which we've discussed, which now refers to Peter and John finding uh, images on an image on the burial cloths. Um,
Mhm.
Also, Pope Gregory the Great, who was representative of the Vatican at that time, when he becomes Pope, he commissions an artwork which he calls the Akira Poeta, uh, and it's a full-length image of Jesus, which he then puts into uh, the Lateran. So
Hmm.
it is through an emperor at that time that the image of God incarnate is put on what they call libera, which are the military standards of the Byzantine army, such as this. This is one from
Mm-hmm.
Constantine the Great.
Yes.
Uh, and the armies of Byzantium then go through all parts of the empire, and they're carrying these libera. And this is how the archetype of Jesus becomes the archetype of Jesus, how it is spread throughout uh, the Byzantine Empire at that time. And on the basis of the army moving that about, then we have some of these 6th and 7th century uh, images, Pantocrator images of Jesus. One of the most famous is this one. It's from
Mm-hmm.
what they call the Homs vase, from the
Mm-hmm.
city of Emissa at that time. And this is why I believe that the image of Edessa was one of these copies that was made of the image of God incarnate. That if you, one of the few representations we have of the image of Edessa, this one is rather famous.
Mm-hmm.
This is
Yes,
also
I've
from
seen that.
St.
Mm-hmm.
Catherine's Monastery. It's been dated
Mm-hmm.
to the year 947 to 960. Now, if you take a look at this, the artist who is painting this, on the image of Edessa, you can see it's a rectangular cloth, and it has
Hmm.
fringe at the bottom. Now,
Yes.
if that was the shroud, you wouldn't find fringe there. You would find a fold there. There would be no
Right.
fringe on the shroud. Similarly, a couple hundred years later, in the illustrations of John Scalides, there is this famous rendering of the image of Edessa being brought to Edessa in 944, presented to the
Yes.
emperor. A lot of people think that this cloth, this kind of pinkish cloth at the bottom, is a shroud, but what I think it is, almost certainly is a loris, probably of the general who is presenting this to the emperor. The image itself is too holy to hold directly with the hands, and he's holding the image with the loris. But again, take a look at in this case, the top of the image, and again, you see the fringe. And you say, where have I seen that before? Why is that familiar? Go back again
Hmm.
to the typical uh, labarum that the
Another
army was
barum, yeah.
carrying, and you see the fringe in this case at the bottom. There's likely some fringe at the top that's folded over the standard there. But that's why I believe what transpired was that the armies were certainly camped out at and around Edessa. There's a historical incident where one of the Byzantine generals had to flee to Edessa with one of these standards, and I believe that that is what the Edessans received. And on the basis of that, they created what was originally a painted icon of Jesus in accordance with the
Mm.
original Abgar legend. And then when the Abgar legend later developed to create a an image of Jesus on cloth, I think they actually used the labarum, which they had in their possession, and that became the image of Edessa. And that's what was returned to Constantinople in 944, and that's what we see in these portrayals.
Interesting. So we have this
So,
distinction potentially here between that Edessa image and the authentic shroud here potentially, but still, but in Constantinople, fairly early, obviously in this scenario,
mhm,
um, and there's so many other things. I was thinking, I want to be careful with our time here because I we can recommend people check the book out for sure. I've got it linked and everything. I would just mention in passing, like you mentioned in there about complications that further arise with the idea of it being in Edessa, if I'm correct, because of the era of the Islamic occupation, right, of Edessa,
yes, mhm,
and how I think you raised some good points in there about at least calling into question the likelihood of the ability to regularly go back and forth or sort of go venerate it,
yes,
if it's under Islamic occupation, which I thought was a good point too.
right,
So there's a lot of other related issues as well potentially with that I found very intriguing.
right. And there is something that once iconoclasm is instituted in the Byzantine Empire in 726. And at that point, you don't hear very much about Jesus' images because they're being suppressed. There is a text, it's called the Tarragona manuscript.
Yes.
It's from about the year 1090, and it describes an image of Jesus which was then being held in the palace. And it provides a history for this image. And it says that this image was once being viewed, but Constantinople was beset by a series of continuous earthquakes, and that this was during the reign of Leo III and then his son, Constantine V. They were iconoclasts. And that in order to stop the earthquakes, uh, the emperor uh, agreed to lock the image away in a golden case and never allow it to be seen again by the public. It could only be seen by the emperors themselves. Now, the only series of continuous earthquakes that struck Constantinople during the reign of an iconoclastic emperor were these earthquakes that took place and which are documented in 740 and 741. So that seems to explain why we no longer hear about the image of God incarnate or about a shroud, because for a
Hmm.
period of centuries then, the shroud was locked away in this golden case and was still there in the year 1090 to 1100 when the Tarragona manuscript was written. Um,
Hmm.
so uh, we kind of know that at that point there are references to a Sindon in Constantinople. Emperor Constantine VII wrote to his army and said that he had consecrated some water with one of the relics that he had, which was the Sindon. And we have various pilgrims from the 12th century who are writing that in the imperial relic collection there is not only a face cloth, that is the mandilion, but there's also a Sindon, which is present there. Uh, and then during this period, very famously, we have the depictions that are in the uh, Codex,
Hmm.
um, which
Yes,
the
the
Pray
pray. That's the
Codex,
Pray Codex. Yeah, yeah.
which show a shroud like Jesus, and
Yes.
which also show uh, what appears to be a cloth which with a herringbone weave
Hmm.
fabric, and also the three or four poker holes that are
The
very
poker holes,
prominent
right?
on the shroud. And
The
that
thumbs
that takes
withdrawn on the hands.
no
All those little
thumbs,
details.
the
Yeah.
a sign on the forehead, a blood stain on the
Yeah.
forehead. And that brings us to approximately 1203, 1204, when Robert de Clary, a crusader, writes that a Sindon having a image of Jesus is being exhibited publicly every Friday in a church in Blatchernay. And
Hmm.
this cloth, supposedly, according to de Clary, it disappears during or after the sack of Constantinople. So it was my intention at this time to kind of go into what happened to the shroud after that, and I know we're running
Yeah.
short on time, so I'll just kind of briefly, very, very briefly
Oh yeah,
summarize
yeah. Go for it,
my
please. Yep.
views on this. I think on the basis of text, the shroud did not disappear in the sack of Constantinople. The
Okay.
palaces were very well secured at that time, and instead it just became part of the Byzantine relic inventory that continued to be kept at the Bucolian Palace. The
Okay.
new Latin emperors were totally engaged in just simply trying to survive for the next 25 years. They were in
Sure.
warfare with Bulgarians and Nicenes, and they were even fighting each other. And finally, in 1228, the new emperor was an 11-year-old boy by the name of Baldwin II, who had to have a regent. And by the year 1234, now the 17-year-old Baldwin married the daughter of his regent, and there is a papal report that says that Constantinople is on the verge of collapsing, and the main problem is that there is no longer any money to finance an army and to finance the defense of the cities.
Hmm.
Baldwin's cousin was Louis IX. He was one of the
Right.
richest rulers in the world. He was an
King of France.
extremely
Yep.
devout person, and he eventually was canonized. And he was at the same time planning to create the Sainte Chapelle in Paris, to which he wanted to
Hmm.
install a number of relics. So he needs relics. Baldwin has relics. He's got money. Baldwin needs money. And so over the course of the next 8 or 9 years, Louis uh, uh, actually acquires 21 or 22 relics from Baldwin. He couldn't buy them, though. This would be simony. And at
Right.
that time, in context, that was a very abominable sin.
Hmm.
and had they engaged in simony, both of them would have lost their thrones through the church. And so there was this arrangement set up where Baldwin would borrow money from Venetians, and then he would default on the loan. He would have given relics to secure the loans, and then the Venetians would be theoretically on the verge of acquiring the relics. And there was an
Yeah,
exception to the simony rule that said that it was not simony for someone to purchase relics to save them from desecration. So
sure.
Louis would then come forward and he would redeem these relics from the Venetian lenders. And it was the same as if Baldwin had sold them directly to uh, Louis for the amounts that
Hmm.
Baldwin had borrowed. And these relics are, including the crown of thorns, are all uh, listed in a golden bull, which was kind of like a bill of sale.
Yeah.
And but at this point, the Shroud of Turin is not involved. Baldwin went on to borrow some more money while Louis was away at crusade in Egypt, and so he couldn't use the scheme that he had been using with Louis being away. So the lenders required some kind of security, and he agreed to give them his son. He had like a seven
This
year
this
old.
was one of my this was one of my favorite parts of your book, not because I'm, some sort of sadist or something, or but it's just so, it's such a what's it, like a soap opera type,
Yeah,
like I've never had a relative, use his own son as sort of, collateral. However, I think, human nature, fallen human nature, we all have relatives that they're always in trouble. There's always something.
yeah.
And I really got that humanity of this. I'm imagining Louis,
Yeah,
like all
and
this,
again, it's the
it's like,
context
you
of the
kidding me?
times. It
Anyway.
shows how
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
impious Baldwin was. But
Sure.
in any event, he did this, and he never could get
Yeah.
the money to repay the loan, and the boy remained in captivity for over 10 years. After Louis got back from the Crusades, and he had been back for a few years, he finally decided he needed to remedy the problem, and he agreed to pay the ransom for Philip, for Baldwin's son.
Hmm.
And the only thing Baldwin could have given him at that time as compensation for what I think would have been about $4.5 million in today's money was to give him the Shroud of Turin. Now, I think that Louis actually thought he was rescuing another relic, feeling that if he didn't
That was
do
the
this,
impression I wondered there, because I mean, there's good reason to believe at that time, like, he's like, look, it's only a matter of time until this thing gets taken by somebody else. At least
right,
if it's with me, it's safe. And I can
right.
see that being
Yeah,
maybe
I
something
think
he's
that
thinking
was his
about.
pious side. And I think what he
Yeah.
neglected was, and I think he was advised of this post facto,
Mm-hmm.
that you really didn't save a relic there. You saved a human being,
Mm-hmm.
and but in payment for that ransom, you received the relic, and that
Yeah.
was simoniacal, and
Yeah.
you can have a big problem here with the church. And so
Mm-hmm.
Louis's best friend at that time was Jean de Joinville. He had
Yeah.
been with him on crusade. He became his chronicler, and I believe he gave him the shroud and asked
Mm-hmm.
him to take care of it and to not make it public until most of these events should be forgotten. Jean de Joinville, which was only discovered, I think, in 1996, it turns out he was the maternal grandfather of Geoffrey de Charnay. De
Lo and
Join,
behold.
Joinville's daughter,
Yeah.
Marguerite, married uh, Geoffrey de Charnay's father. And
Mm-hmm.
I believe that this became her dower property. And according to her arrangement with her father, I believe it was bequeathed to her youngest son, and Geoffrey, and she died in 1306, and Geoffrey was about 6 years old at
Mm-hmm.
that time. I believe the shroud continued to be held in Joinville until Geoffrey later on decided that he was going to open up the church in Lirey. He needed a fabulous relic
Mm-hmm.
to draw people to the church, and I think that's when he retrieved the shroud from Joinville and began to exhibit it. This would
Wow.
explain, unlike a lot of the other hypotheses for the missing years,
Mm-hmm.
it would explain why Geoffrey de Charnay never said where he got the shroud. It would also explain how he was able to exhibit it, because you couldn't exhibit without papal approval. So
Mm-hmm.
the Pope, knowing this story, knew that it was authentic, and he verbally allowed it to be exhibited. And there's some written evidence of this from the
Was
Bishop
that
of
before,
Troyes.
Jack? Was that before or after Canon 62, or what's the relation there with?
Yes, that the Canon
Is,
62 was the canon from the uh, conference, Church Council of 1215, Fourth Lateran Council, I think,
Fourth
which
Lateran.
said
Okay,
that
yes. Yeah.
henceforth, relics, because of the scandal that had been created by the relics being
Yes.
seized from Constantinople, all
Mm-hmm.
exhibitions of new relics would have to have papal approval. And the
Right.
Bishop of Troyes in 1356 wrote a letter in which he acknowledged that
Right.
uh, the cult in Lirey had been canonically approved, meaning that the Pope had to have approved it. But it would show why even
Yes.
the Church did not want the history, because to establish the province of the Shroud from Constantinople, the story with Louis the Ninth would have had to come into play. By that time, Louis was a canonized saint. He was
Mm-hmm.
the highest respected French state saint, and the papacy was then in Avignon, not in
That's the
Rome.
yeah. A lot of people forget it's right down the street.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so if the church couldn't afford a dispute with the French
Yeah.
people over their saying, so I think they simply did not say anything. They imposed
Yeah.
silence, and Jeffrey abided by that. And so I think that perfectly explains why we don't know what the background of the shroud is. And remember,
Mm.
this is the second time the history of the shroud has been interfered with. Justinian made up a
Right.
legend which did away with his Antiochene and apostolic history. And now you have the church and Geoffrey agreeing to silence, and thereby not explaining why the Shroud of Lirey is the Shroud of Constantinople. So that's kind of
Sure.
it in a nutshell. Of course, the details are in my book. And I also have an appendix in the book which goes over, I think it's some 15 other hypotheses of where the shroud may have been
Mm-hmm.
between 1204 and 1355.
Yeah. Well, and I I'm just stunned here, like that our time has flown by this quick here, Jack. If you're game, I'd love to have you back on and maybe dig in some more detail on some of the other pieces of this, because there's so much more. There's so many tributaries and potential, you know, little side roads and stuff that we could go down. But I think this is a great overall sketch. Definitely recommend people to get the book, and it's a really fascinating read. Every single page of it, you're not paying me to say this.
No.
I just really love, it's just exciting. If you love history at all, or you're just interested and it's so well sourced. You have this huge section of footnotes and such. So it's on Kindle also. If you like Kindle, I have mine up here right now. So,
Mm.
but
Well,
Jack,
I
thank you so much.
appreciate
Oh, go
that.
ahead. Sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I appreciate that. And,
Yeah.
I do think that what I tried to accomplish was that uh, there would not be a tremendous amount of pointed criticism about it, because it is documented. I mean, people have different opinions as to how much weight various pieces of
Hmm.
evidence have. You're going to have that. But I don't think that, uh, in terms of what I've laid out, that any of it does not make any sense, and that some
Sure.
of it, if not all of it, is highly persuasive. If you believe the
Sure.
shroud is authentic, I think that is it's an excellent authenticity history. If you don't believe the shroud's authentic, then most of it doesn't mean anything to you anyway.
Right. Well said. Well, thank you, Jack, for joining us here today, and hopefully catch up with you in the future for sure.
Okay, Mike, it's been my pleasure, and I'd be glad to do any other shows on other topics that you might want to do.
Yeah, very good. Well, God bless you. Take care.
Same to you, Michael. See you now.
What an intriguing, fascinating conversation. It was a real delight to be able to talk to Jack. And I said to him a couple times, I was just thinking about it, that, I mean, the church in every era has its controversies, and so especially some of those later portions, that we were talking about. I mean, there's no two ways about it. The sack of Constantinople is one of the darkest chapters in the whole history of Christianity. It's just this horrible, terrible, terrible moment. And what's fascinating to me is, you're talking about all this intrigue, like with Justinian, and all these different theories that Jack was putting out there and trying to support with the evidence. There, there's political intrigue, there's church intrigue, there's deception, there is infighting, there's squabbles, there's war, there's theft. I mean, there's all kinds of just chaos along the whole way. But here's what I think is a really neat thing to end on, okay? And that is, say for whatever your own opinion is, of course, just, imagine here for a second that it is indeed the authentic burial shroud of Jesus. That means God has a purpose for it. And God is so clever, it's so genius, so perfectly providential in all of his planning that, we see this all through Scripture, right? I mean, it's like a trope at this point. I mean, God writes straight with crooked lines. God constantly, all through human history, is about taking the very worst that we can do and trying to bring about the very best he can through it. And you think of Joseph in the Old Testament, who goes through all this suffering. His brothers sell him into slavery in Egypt. He's falsely accused of making advances towards his boss's wife and gets sent to prison. Like, all this just drama, right? Soap opera type stuff. And at the very end of that dramatic story, when Joseph is reunited with his brothers and forgives them, there's that beautiful line where he says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. In other words, a lot of times, even the best of us, even saints, legitimate saints of the church, right? Every saint is a sinner who is at the work of repenting. We all make mistakes. We all commit sins. It's, at the end of the day, not ultimately about our perfection. It's about him trying to perfect us. And if indeed, as I believe is the case, God has in his providence, through very wild and completely unimaginable circumstances in some cases along the way, if this story is even partly correct, God has providentially preserved this wonderful artifact, this relic, that enables us to have potentially, a more dramatic and meaningful and personal way of connecting with him and reflecting on his suffering. As I often say, one of the things I think is most important, and the thing that I come back to time and again with these questions about the shroud, for me, it always comes down to what window can it give me into the true suffering that he went through in his passion and resurrection. That's what it's about. It's not about being right or being wrong, and like who's basically holding the answer key here. It's about being held in the hand of the one who is the answer, who is Christ himself. And so I encourage you to enter into encounter with him, and don't shut the door on him wherever he's trying to knock, okay? So God bless you all. Thank you so much for tuning in to the Gracious Guest Show, and until next time, don't forget to wonder. Take care.